Hi, everybody. Hi. I think we're going to start now. It's 5 past. We got a good crowd for a weeknight. And yeah, I'm just so delighted actually to see this crowd here. I am Naomi Klein. I'm the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies, which most of you know is a collaboration between the School of Communications and Information, the Department of Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Institute for Women and Leadership. And I'm glad to see colleagues from all of those different arms here today. The chair is inspired by Gloria Steinem's heterodox life. It is all about making connections and crossing boundaries between sectors and disciplines and movements. And there's really no subject that embodies the need for that kind of boundary crossing more than our response to the climate crisis, since the climate crisis encompasses everything on Earth. So we do need to cross those boundaries. And I want to acknowledge the students from the Gender and Media Studies minor who are here today, as well as some of my students who I see. Thank you for coming. My latest book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, is about the intersection of different crises and fires that we face and how we might respond to them. And the urgent need for a Green New Deal, one that is truly transformational and intersectional, is what we are going to be digging into tonight with this amazing group of speakers. This is the second in a series of events that I'm hosting this academic year as part of the chair's flagship project. They are public panels like this one, followed by movement meetings where we dig into specific and under-theorized aspects of the conversation that we've been having about a Green New Deal. Now, if any of you are tweeters, please tweet. We have a hashtag, it's not up there, but it is hashtag migrant GND, GND as in Green New Deal. Yeah, but otherwise, please turn your phones to silent. I want to thank, as always, my wonderful collaborator and colleague, Kylie Davidson, who did a huge amount of work planning and scheduling and putting this event together, as well as my co-conspirators at the LEAP, particularly Rajiv Sakora and Avi Lewis, who've also helped put this on. So thank you both so much. The LEAP is an organization that Avi and I co-founded to map a science and justice-based response to the climate crisis. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go to theleap.org. And our Twitter account, which is theleap_org, is going to be live tweeting this event. So if you are tweeting, you might want to go to the Leap account and you can get everybody's handle there and just retweet and add. Much of our work at the LEAP is about supporting the global push for a Green New Deal, a vision for how the climate crisis can be a catalyst to create huge numbers of unionized living wage jobs while battling racial and gender injustices and exclusions at the same time. And we're really trying to stress the global nature of this. There is no such thing as climate justice that stops at the border. There is no such thing as a nationalist Green New Deal. With this event series at Rutgers, we are looking at a few key parts of this discussion, the Green New Deal discussion, that are often marginalized by emission reduction experts. Our goal with this series is not to be comprehensive about all the aspects of a Green New Deal, because it really is a blueprint for the next economy, so it's pretty impossible to be truly comprehensive. What we decided to do is zero in on a few areas where we have noticed some notable gaps in how this debate is playing out at the national level. And not surprisingly, several of those gaps involve the labor and knowledge of women, the labor and knowledge of immigrants, and the labor and knowledge of indigenous peoples. The first in this series that some of you attended was on care work, nursing, home care, teaching. And because so many workers in these sectors are women from the global south, migration came up several times in that panel very organically. We had two Filipino women who spoke about the impact of Typhoon Haiyan on them and their colleagues. But tonight we're going to go deeper and focus directly on how migration intersects with the climate crisis, and also how migrant justice can and must be at the center of a Green New Deal. So I want to get right into it with our wonderful panelists, and I will introduce them all briefly, and then they'll each have about 5 minutes to talk about how these issues are intersecting in their day-to-day work. Maxine Burkett, I'm just going to go down to my left, is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, where I first met her, and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is also co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit Institute for Climate and Peace. Maxine is an expert in the law and policy of climate change, with a specific focus on climate justice, climate-induced migration, peace, and conflict. Oh, I'm not going in order, or I can go in order. Saket Soni is next to Maxine, is founder and director of Resilience Force, a national initiative to transform the U.S.'s response to natural disasters by strengthening and securing this country's resilience workforce. And I first met Saket, I guess 15 years ago now, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, when Saket was in New Orleans organizing the migrant workforce that was rebuilding that city, clearing away the debris, doing all of the labor, and then facing deportation for their efforts. Saket previously co-founded and led the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice, fighting for both U.S.-born and immigrant workers engaged in the reconstruction of New Orleans after Katrina. He then went on to lead the National Guestworker Alliance, an organization focused on defending the human rights and dignity of guest workers in America. He also is a co-organizer of tonight's event, which is to say he really is the brains behind this operation and thinking who really needed to be in dialogue to make this work. And so Saket is going to be playing a bit of a co-moderator role, right, Saket? And next to Saket is Maria Rodriguez, the first executive director of the Florida Immigrant Coalition, a bold and dynamic social movement organization that seeks the fair and equal treatment of all people, including immigrants. It builds and aggregates the connection, consciousness, and capacity of its diverse membership across 10 counties in Florida. And of course, Florida is probably the most climate vulnerable part of this country. Next to Maria is Patrice Lawrence, recently appointed co-director of the Undocu Black Network. She served prior as the network's national policy and advocacy director, leading the network's advocacy efforts on immigrants' rights and racial justice. Patrice works with the goal of transforming the realities of Black undocumented people so they live their fullest lives. So as you can see, we really do have a wonderful group here. And I'm going to ask you, Maxine, to kick us off.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Aloha. It's great to be here. I've been tasked, I think, with sort of painting the picture and putting it in sort of the frame, which is that the climate change is the context, the climate crisis is the context, and we have to see sort of landscapes that seem familiar in that context, which means that there's significant change. And sort of at the outset, I'll say that it's important to acknowledge and to some degree concede that migration is something we've done for millennia, and also certainly in modern history is sort of always understood to be sort of a multi-causal event. And I can sort of attest to it. Patrice and I realized that we were both from Jamaica. And I know I was too young to be a part of the conversation, but there are multiple drivers that sort of induced my parents to move. There was the political and economic drivers that my father was considering, social drivers for my mom, namely her husband was moving to New York City. They had a decision-making process, and then they usually decide to migrate or stay. They decided to migrate to Jamaica, Queens. But I sort of suggest that climate change is sort of not your mother's driver, right? It's a completely different kind of event. And so in trying to think about how we can understand its relationship to migration, because it's a massive topic, because you could think about it cross-border or internally, I'm going to do sort of a who, what, where, when, right? Just to give you, just to frame it, tame it a little bit. So who? I mean, we're talking about numbers of people that have been estimated, wildly estimated, between sort of 25 million to 1 billion that might be moving as a result of climate change impacts. That's a factor of 40. And I like to tell my students, planning for 25 billion to 1 billion is really difficult. As if my husband said, we're going to have a dinner party, could be 25, could be 1,000. Let's menu plan based on that information. It's really difficult, yet you can understand why, for sort of political salience and for truly planning for this this kind of movement of people, you need to have some understanding of what we're talking about. Part of what's difficult with actually knowing who will be moving, what the numbers are, is because to derive numbers, it requires a lot of information that even if you're looking at the physical science, is hard to come at. And then you're also dealing with the sort of specifics of human behavior, the push and pull factors in a particular community, the fact that actually migrating is a luxury in many cases. There's of the who, we need to be thinking about trapped populations, those who do not have the resources to move and are the poorest of the poor. And so when you're frontline, oftentimes that means you're actually not able to move at all. We also, again, when you're devising numbers, it's difficult because you, say for sea level rise, you're thinking about low elevation coastal zones, okay, so you sort of overlay populations, overlay sort of a bathtub image, and you come up with a number. Those numbers themselves range from 444 million upwards, and it's not necessarily, again, accounting for decision making. I think all of us remember hearing stories, or at least seeing stories about people who are flooded, who say the exact opposite of what you think they might say. They say, I'm not going anywhere, right? We're staying right here. In fact, New Jersey, after Superstorm Sandy, had many stories like that. So that becomes an important element of sort of the difficulty of settling on a number. Cross-border migration, again, is a big part of who might move from countries outside of, say, the United States, for example. Most of that migration is going to happen regionally. If it does happen, cross-border migration is of the most difficult kind of movement because of the legal barriers, the very firm borders that we have created. So when we're thinking about difficulty, cross-border migration is very high on that scale. But when we think about sheer numbers, internally displaced peoples are much, much higher. And that's actually a consideration also for the United States. The other who that I want us to think about is the host communities. Where are people going? How do we support the communities that are going to be receiving those who are moving? The what, very somewhat quickly, climate intersects, researchers are trying to find a good way to make a more direct sort of causal link between what would be a climate migration versus survival migration generally, or any other kind of ways in which we might decide to move. And so there are 5 scenarios that have been identified as kind of encompassing the typical scenarios. Sudden onset disaster. This is Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, frankly, some of the intense flooding. It doesn't necessarily have to be a hurricane that we've seen in Houston. I'll get back to Houston in a second. We have slow onset events. Sea level rise is a perfect example of that. If we continue with our current emission scenarios on the higher end, could be up to 13 million people from the coast of the United States moving inland. There's a great research article that's basically asking, why does Austin need to care about sea level rise? Well, that's actually going to be a receiving community. We have in small island developing states, we have really unique issues that happen in those spaces. Not only are there sudden and slow onset events, there's also the specter of loss of territory from a number of factors, actually. Impacts that are often very evocative are ones of the sort of drowning islands. But in fact, right now, they're very hot. There isn't fresh water. There's some really near-term issues that are actually going to be more significant in terms of thinking about migration and loss of habitability in the island context. There's planned relocation. That's happening right now in the United States, and the indigenous communities are on the front lines. The Pacific Northwest, in Alaska, the Louisiana Delta region. And the last is, the last of the 5 sort of identified discrete scenarios are conflict that's resulting from some kind of resource strain that itself induces people to move because the space is no longer, again, viable. And we could talk in multiple ways about what that might look like, but you can see a climate fingerprint, certainly in the Syria disaster. in terms of, of migration, and even in the migrant caravan. Happy to talk more about it, but I know I have not enough time for that. Again, the where is largely internal, mostly in the global south. If you're thinking about the numbers that we've, the hundreds of millions that we're talking about, most of that movement is going to be regional. In the United States, again, Maria saw displacements. Sea level rise in affiliated Pacific Islands is becoming more and more relevant and of interest. Houston's really fascinating. It's a sending, transit, and receiving city if we're thinking about migration within the US. It's also a city that's seen 500-year storms. It's sort of like a conveyor belt style. And it's really important to think about what that means. I mean, 500, Columbus sailed the ocean blue 500 years ago. In that time, in the creation of this country, the centuries of enslavement, the Civil War, the World War I and II, in that time, you expect one of the storms that hit Houston to happen. But in fact, it's had 5, and it's in this very interesting intersection of being this space for multiple kinds of people that are facing migration. There's also, in the where, I just want to say a little bit about places that are actually potentially sort of climate havens, if you will, like Duluth, Minnesota. There's interesting research right now on where will people go. Well, what about cities like Duluth that has its own microbrewery, and it's really a hip place to be, and there are great restaurants, and it's pretty empty right now, and it'll be very warm. And it has a huge lake that looks like an ocean if you look at it the right way. And so there's some actual interest, in terms of where are people going and what might be plausible. When the numbers used to be about 2010, then 2050, we blew past 2010, but 2050, and that's just because I think it's a round number, it's halfway to the end of the century, at least when we started looking at most of the research. It doesn't say much about the stock or the flow. So when you say there are 200 million people moving in 2050, have they moved? Is it complete? Are they in motion? There's a lot of uncertainty about it, and this is actually, just to sort of put a bookmark on this, that more research is needed, obviously, on this. But I would suggest that it's research that's really hyper-local and very equity-centered, because the issue is so overwhelming, climate and then migration, this is really ripe for sort of fuel for xenophobic undercurrents. And in fact, you see a lot of discussion about migration, especially at the border, happening in securitized spaces. And you can, if you frame it as a security issue, all of your solutions are going to look like weaponized borders and those sorts of details I'm sure we'll get into. And then just quickly on the why, I have to say, as someone who ended up becoming an attorney, I don't know if any of you remember Gary Larson in The Far Side. This may be why I became an attorney. He had an image of a cow being cross-examined, and the attorney said, the question is not how. How is no longer what we want to know. Why now, brown cow? And I thought, that's brilliant. Okay, why? Why is this happening? We know how, some of the elements of it, as complex as it is. Why? I think this is now my refrain for all conversations related to climate change. We need to reduce our emissions. There's no question about it. I know it's obvious. The difference between what makes that factor of 40 so powerful is that some of that is about how we move the dial. And it's really not plausible to think about 1 billion people moving with all of the other climate impacts that we're anticipating, and host communities themselves having to remain resilient in the face of constantly shifting baselines. So all climate scenarios depend on whether or not we're able to reduce our emissions and manage it accordingly. And in fact, we'll be able to tell the story of why in 2050 based on what we do today. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Saket?
Let me start with a question to all of you. How many of you have ever moved? Wow, isn't that incredible? And so we all have a basis somewhere in our lives to understand the mass movement of people. We're not strangers to it. And we may be in some way or the other different from the immigrant in crisis. But we all have access to the fundamentals, which are simply, as Maxine put it, from time immemorial, people have moved. I want to take you to one place where 3 people had to move, and just tell you a quick story to start. The place is called Panama City. It is in the United States, in a place few people move to and many people move from. It's in the Florida Panhandle, a place that isn't anywhere close to Miami, much closer to Alabama, geographically and politically. It is inhabited mostly by people who vote conservative and who claim roots there. It's inhabited by people who largely would think of themselves as of a place, not intending to move away. And so I went there because a few years ago, 2 years ago, Hurricane Michael ravaged 6 counties in the Florida Panhandle, reduced most towns to 20% of their housing stock after it hit. And on one particular block of Panama City, one particular house was hit particularly brutally. And on top of that house, there were 2 people who moved there to help. One was named Mario and another was named Gustavo. They both came from Honduras via New Orleans, where they had helped build after Katrina. They were now on top of this roof in Panama City, helping to rebuild the home of an Army veteran who himself had moved away after Hurricane Michael hit. And they were having a conversation about their fishing village. They figured out while they were on the roof that they lived close to each other in Honduras, where one was a fisherman and another was a very poor fisherman. They were talking about what it was like to take their kids fishing. The good fishermen enjoyed it. The bad fishermen hated it. I won't reveal who was the good and bad fisherman of the 2. That was my deal in being allowed to tell the story. But at some point, Gustavo asked Mario a question. He asked, how old his children were, and he didn't get an answer. Now, they were both laying blue tarp on this roof to protect this home from any future damage. And it had started raining while they were working. And Gustavo was asking Mario, how old are your kids? And all of a sudden, there was no answer. And Gustavo turned around, and Mario was no longer on the roof. He had slipped and fallen. And so very, very slowly, very, very carefully, Gustavo started to tread his way off that very steep roof. Now, Gustavo and Mario are both resilience workers. They are part of a rising workforce in the United States, particularly since Hurricane Katrina, because of the pace and destructiveness and increasing fury of climate disaster. Just like there was once a rising auto industry and a group of workers rose with it, a group of workers we all know and understand now, there have been, in the last 15 years, a rising set of workers who are preparing and repairing our societies for climate change. They include people like Gustavo and Mario who rebuild and repair, but they also include workers in the healthcare industry. They include workers who are care workers doing elder care and other kinds of care work. They include counselors, teachers, transportation workers. And largely, they are workers in 2 kinds of sectors. The workers who are rebuilding physical infrastructure, construction workers, and workers who are rebuilding social infrastructure, care workers. Now, it's been exciting to bring all of those workers into the conversation about the Green New Deal. They are also the workers who were left out of the original New Deal. When the New Deal was passed, the Southern Democrats vetoed it until they could get their carve-outs, their exceptions. And the places that were left out were the South. The people who were left out were casual workers, domestic workers, day laborers, farm workers, tipped workers like restaurant workers, different types of public sector workers. In other words, people who were the workers largely who were the descendants of slaves, largely in the sharecropping and other casual industries, and largely workers of color in the South. Today, resilience workers are in large part these migrant workers. There's a second set of migrants that are connected to climate change, and those are the types of people like the one whose home Gustavo and Mario were fixing. These are people who might have been US born, largely are US born, whose homes are being destroyed and are moving. The person whose home Mario and Gustavo was fixing, I don't think ever made it to Duluth, but is still not back in his home. And so we are talking about the climate crisis and a solution to the climate crisis. The solution, the Green New Deal, is a bold, imaginative one, but it is very important that that solution not repeat the mistakes of the first New Deal. And for that, we need to think about particularly how communities of color and migrant communities get involved. Now, I would just say the important thing here is we know very little actually about migration for all the migration that has occurred inside and to the United States. As Maxine said, we know a lot from a law enforcement perspective because all of our policy has been made through a law enforcement lens. But we actually know very little about migration from the point of view of the migrant. We know very little about what it's like, the loss of home, the traumatic decision to leave, the mixed feelings and guilt about having left, the ability or inability to keep up intimacy with those who go back, the ability to go back and reconnect after you haven't been able to. All of these facts of life, the facts of life for an immigrant, are about to become the facts of life for many, many people in the United States. Our nation knows very little about immigration from the point of view of immigrants at exactly the moment where it needs to know the most, because it is about to have the most migrants it has ever had, both from new societies, the people on the caravan or other places who will need to come, and more even from inside the United States. So that's why this inquiry and this discussion is particularly important right now. It's important in law, it's important in culture, it's important in politics to figure out how to fully include the expertise, perspectives, and experiences of migrants. And the vehicle we have for transforming our relationship to climate change right now, the most promising vehicle we have is the Green New Deal, which is what makes this particularly timely. So I'll stop there just to give a sense of why this discussion is so important and hand it over. And just the last thing I would say is that this is the time that we all have to pull as many people into the Green New Deal as possible. And it's the right time to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Maria, I'd love to hear you speak about this remarkable coalition that you're a part of in Florida.
Thank you,
Yeah,
thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and Rutgers is so lucky to have Naomi Klein here. Let's make sure you take full advantage of her, and thank you, Saket, for including me in this conversation. In the 5 minutes that I have, I want to perhaps do a little bit of bragging.
Do it.
And then have a little confession, and then give some examples, and that's what I want to do. Part of the bragging is really around movement building, and the reason I think it's so relevant is because as a climate movement maybe, is going through this opportunity, I think these are some of the questions that we grappled as we built the immigrant rights movement in Florida. Our mission statement, as was said, is to build the connection, consciousness, and capacity so that people can live, love, and labor without fear. Connection, we found, is very important. Important because that's the way where people can move from understanding their situation as a personal problem to more of a system, symptoms of a system. Connection because when people share their story, they feel emboldened and encouraged and feel the courage to take greater and more escalated action, which is so urgently needed. And connection because when you keep people engaged and involved, and in action and in activity, they will try new things and innovate and become bolder. And so that's why connection is so important. Consciousness speaks for itself, but it's not just political education, it's really intentionality around leadership and the spaces that we create. And then capacity for action. And we've been increasingly wanting to move from being a protest movement to a movement that's building non-patriarchal governing power and really exploring governance and helping people govern their body, their homes, their unions, their institutions, their schools, their churches, their budgets. And we feel like that's a very important part of democracy, and especially for so many of our families who've been marginalized and exploited. The bragging relates to some of our most David versus Goliath. So at times when it feels so unsurmountable, when it feels so overwhelming to address climate, sí se puede, yes we can, we nu capab. You know, to have some of the most exploited and marginalized communities defeat the Corrections Corporation of America against building one of the largest family prisons with the support of a Democratic Congresswoman, and we're able to defeat that. Yes, we brought stories against criminalization, but we also used anything in our toolbox, and in this case, the threat of a NEPA lawsuit, because they were building this 1 mile within the Everglades. We defeated the Tea Party governor in bringing the Arizona copycat bill. We defeated the Florida Retail Federation, where we came together with unions when we noticed on the edges they were becoming xenophobic, we said, no, our fates are intertwined. The exploitation of immigrants is linked to the lack of class consciousness, and so we're able to pass some of the most progressive wage theft ordinances in the country in a state that not only has no income tax but also has no Department of Labor. So people had nowhere to turn. We've also won access to college, and currently we're building a movement of the bigger we. Obviously, not obviously, but we've been committed to youth leadership, to elevating the profile of Black immigrants and the leadership of Black immigrants. In South Florida is the region of the country with the largest number of Black immigrants. We're proud co-founders of the Black Immigrant Network. And so we've recently engaged more refugees and started to work with legal permanent residents so that we would build the political heft of immigrants in Florida. We've registered 30,000 voters in the last 6 months. So we definitely want to impact policy, but we need to impact politics in order to do that. But we now understand more deeply than ever that we have to shift culture and really address culture, and that's an enigma. The confession is that one of our key ways to battle criminalization in Florida and interrupt the detention deportation machinery has been fighting for driver's licenses. The irony in that, given this conversation, is definitely touching. But let me tell you ways that we see the intersection of climate and the work that we understand. Immigrants undocumented immigrants in particular are the most vulnerable. In 2017, when we had that huge Hurricane Irma that was wider than the whole peninsula, more than 6.8 million Floridians sought refuge in New Orleans, Atlanta. There was a huge internal migration. And sheriffs in Polk County, our sheriff in Polk County said he's going to check everybody's paper as they come into hurricane shelter. Of course, we reached out to the governor and interrupted that. But the race and xenophobia that impacts the vulnerability of immigrants, given that. The previously known Haitian Women of Miami, now the Family Action Network movement, is at the crossroads of immigration and climate change as they're fighting climate gentrification, given that their little corner, little Haiti of Miami is actually an elevated area, and so getting a lot of push around gentrification. Another of our founding groups, the Farm Worker Association, who's been working on food sovereignty, is also leading the heat stress bill right now, where the most basic protections for workers like shade and water are being denied on a daily basis. You mentioned Gustavo, who fell off the roof. For every 14 floors of a building, there's one worker death. So immigrants many times are the ones who are under the elements in many of the industries that we're looking at. And finally, I'll end with a quote of one of the ag guys who said something like, Americans have to decide whether they want foreign food picked by foreign hands or American produce or American food picked by foreign hands, and that's a national security issue. We need comprehensive labor reform. It was very, very interesting to see that shift in paradigm, and I think that's the type of paradigm shift we need. And I know, Naomi, the work that you've done, that the work of climate is not about polar bears, it's about people. And the vulnerability of climate gives us an opportunity to show our human side and our shared vulnerability. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is about how we stay human in a warming world as less and less of our world becomes inhabitable, right? And so how do we live together in more density while treating each other better than we're treating each other right now? And that is a big challenge. And it's a challenge, as you say, not just of infrastructure and policy, but it's really about values, deep values. So Patrice, I want you to talk to us about, I think Black migration specifically is often really erased, even though these communities are very much on the front lines of the crisis. So,
yeah. Thank you. Hi, I'm Patrice. I guess I'll start off by going like real to basics. Only to kind of give an idea of what folks are going through, what we've witnessed, who we're made up of, and the difficult decisions that you have to make when your home is ravaged. So, as born in Jamaica, I've been through a few of these. Anyone ever been through a hurricane? Yeah. Anyone know what the prep is for the hurricane, right? What do you have to do? Yeah. So, the tape on the windows, batteries, lamp, all these different pieces. And, it's interesting when folks talk about adages and cliches, right? You're supposed to what is it? Prepare, if you fail to prepare to fail. And the interesting thing about those is that sometimes they're not true, and I think nowhere is that more relevant than when we talk about what really happens when a disaster strikes. And you can do all the prep that you want. You can buy all the batteries, have all the bottled water in your home. I remember when I was younger, we had big glass windows, kind of from the bottom up to the top. And I would help as a child to put the tape on the windows and, all these different things. But I never knew, and I had no control. We have no control over or power over wind, over water, over what might happen if a branch strikes through that window, over what might happen if that roof decides to lift up, you know? So it's like real human things that I think experience has a lot to do with. And on DocuBlack, we talk a lot from the place of experience because we've all been undocumented or are currently undocumented and happen to be Black and are often mischaracterized or overlooked, whatever it is, because we blend in so well, you know. I didn't know that Dr. Burkett was a Jamaican until, you know, she told me, and I'm still waiting for the accent to come out. But yeah, so anyone know what TPS is? I know Maria mentioned it. Anyone knows what TPS is? Yeah? Anyone want to shout it out? Temporary protected status. Yep, temporary protected status, right? And so it is a status, it's a protection that's given to individuals who are here in the United States when something happens to their homeland, right? And that includes war, it includes crisis, but it also includes environmental disasters. And so one country in particular that got this in 2010, anyone knows? Yay, Haiti. And so anyone knows what happened to Haiti in the past few years in terms of what the government did to their TPS? They killed it. They're hanging on by a thread, by a lawsuit that we expect to possibly be overturned. And we've been playing lovely football in Washington, which is where I moved to. I've lived in about 7 different states. Don't worry, DC is actually really Black, by the way. I just thought I would like quell that real quick. And people are like, oh, DC is really Black and has a lot of indigenous folks and like, you know, we're Black. But my point being about something that Maxine mentioned, which was the legal barriers. And that's what we face every day. And it really brings up the question of who deserves to be stable in this country? Who deserves certainty in this country? And I think when we look at our laws, when we look at the way how we treat folks who have had to flee from disaster, who have had to go from an onshore situation to something that they thought would be sure in the United States, it's very clear that stability is not a value that we think is inherent to non-citizens. And I question that as we would talk about climate justice and migrant justice. How will we solve one versus the other? Is there a way to do it together? And is there a way to do it ethically? And what does all of that involve? And how do we make sure that all communities are represented? I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. These are amazing panelists. Thank you. So I want to zero in on what would the principles be of a Green New Deal that really centered migrant justice, right? Because you know, the whole idea of a Green New Deal is we don't just want climate action, we want climate justice. So this needs to be guided by the science, but it also needs to be guided by justice. And the core principles of justice as it relates to climate, as far as I understand it, is that the people who did the least to create this crisis and yet are affected most by it, and that's just like basic physics of this crisis, right, are owed something, right, are kind of creditors in this equation. And the people who did the most to create the crisis, and there's different ways of calculating that, you know, maybe it's the top 100 fossil fuel companies, maybe it's the countries with the largest historical emissions, maybe it is the 20% of humanity responsible for 70% of emissions. I mean, but we do know who is responsible for the emissions. Have to contribute more to this crisis. So it's, you know, it's the way we talk about migration in this country and around the world is like it is sort of some kind of noblesse oblige to like open up our borders because we're good people, right? And so I want to I want to talk first about, what should we be saying we owe to each other within the context of a Green New Deal? And I want Maxine to talk about it from a legal perspective, because but I think it's also about, what do we owe the workers who are putting up the tarps on people's homes and falling off? And, these are workers treated as, doubly disposable, in this economy. And so, but let's come to that afterwards. And okay. Climate debt, climate reparations,
Yeah,
Maxine.
So, okay, in like 2 minutes, or
Take some time.
Take some time. I'll do my best. I'll sort of think specifically about reparative measures, and then more generally about what it means to repair in this context. And we need to reduce emissions. Say that one more time.
Stop the crime in progress.
Stop the crime in progress. And I do think and I can say more about the sort of the elements of litigation, specifically the cases that cities and states are bringing against the fossil fuel companies. I think this is really critically important because the cities, even if they're well-meaning, and even if they have equity-centered adaptation programming that they'd like to introduce, simply can't afford what we're talking about here. Building roads. I mean, we're talking about $100 billion or so. Just sort of like to when we think about the cities en masse, trying to just get the infrastructure down, much less allow for people to move. We also know that for relocation, the cost of relocation varies between $200,000 to $1 million per person to relocate a community. So if you're talking about even communities in Alaska that maybe have 100 or 200 people, you're talking about many millions of dollars that it will take to actually allow for them to move. So there is just a straight up need to assist relocation, and to have a funding that assists that. That's just the baseline, so that it isn't ad hoc and disorganized, which almost certainly will be less favorable in terms of bouncing back once you've moved to a new place. And that's the same is needed for the host communities. I think this is really important to consider. We have to imagine that a number of the places that people will be moving to are also stressed, and will be increasingly so. So understanding how to ease that transition and how to support that will be really important. At the international level, if we're talking about cross-border migration, again, this is sort of more regional. How can we think about policy that actually supports the internal displacement concerns that countries will have? Internal and then cross-border within, again, region. So in parts of Latin America or the Northern Triangle, how do what does it mean to actually support other countries in doing that? Thinking about, I use aid guardedly for a reason, but thinking about what that would look like to actually have a sort of climate migration mindful approach to how we support countries in dealing with the relocation within their boundaries. It's true as well that the borders are sort of useless when you think about the physical map and how climate change interacts with the world, right? And it sort of reinforces this notion that there is a national security interest that's in the U.S. that's different somehow from a mile across the river, for example, in Mexico. But the border question is a big one, and can we think about policy that allows for us to have a more sensible and appropriate border approach? So there have been colleagues of mine that have written op-eds about, could we imagine the United States taking in climate migrants proportional to our emissions, historic and current emissions, right? What would it look like if we could capture that number and allow for there to be free movement? There's specific measures we might think about in that regard. Generally speaking, I've been thinking a lot about reparations, and I've written a bit on it, and I do think that the piece of this that's about sort of the guarantee of non-repetition, right? Creating the circumstances in which this kind of exploitation doesn't happen again, just by sort of like, sort of heartbreaking, sort of irony. Wow, like what a coincidence that this is the same country that has a sliver of the emissions is the one that's risking going under. I've been thinking about this more in a sort of first do no harm kind of way, and sort of the winners take all, that sort of understanding that a lot of the work that we need to do is not doing what we're doing in other countries and other spaces. And that exploitation of labor historically and to date is really calling into question the ways in which we are making communities more vulnerable by our actions. So if we pulled back on those pieces, this is a sort of bigger picture, then I have a note that just says, stop doing what sucks. Like, how do we do that, right? And if we figure out how to allow for a Green New Deal to think expansively, and again, climate being a context, being the precursor for all of these decision-making pieces, a lot of what we do is not doing, right? A lot of it is actually not doing harm in the first place here and across borders.
But I also think that there's an element where if we're not very deliberate about this, things actually get a lot worse in the midst of disasters, right? And this is, the context in which we first met, right? That, New Orleans after Katrina became a site of hyper exploitation, people being locked onto their work sites and so on. And I sort of always seen the Green New Deal as a sort of, a counter shock doctrine, right? Because it's not like if we don't have a Green New Deal, it's just status quo. What Maria was describing as well is, people are being, are expected to work under extreme heat conditions. In fire, in California, people are passing out because they're picking fruit in the smoke. In Los Angeles, gardeners and housekeepers aren't being told that their work sites are under evacuation. So, I mean, it strikes me, Saket, that when you use this, you've used this phrase "resilience force" really deliberately, right? Because there's actually there's an assumption of way too much resilience, right, about what immigrants can actually take, right? Talk about how you're using this term and how you think it should inform the Green New Deal.
Yeah, so there are many meanings to the word resilience, the freedom that we have that a law professor may not have is that we can choose which meaning to deploy at what time, right? And so we are arguing for a meaning of resilience that really goes back to its original radical meaning in indigenous communities and communities of color before it got to mean only how buildings can be better, right? And before it was used to kind of put the onus back on communities of color and poor communities to just look after themselves. The original meaning, I would argue, was a much more collective meaning of resilience. How can we all be stronger together through our interdependence? So Gustavo, who saw Mario fall off the roof, comes down and sees him lying in a pool of his blood. He hasn't yet died, and calls 911. The hospital doesn't admit him. It takes enormous amount of advocacy to have him be seen. The healthcare system isn't designed to absorb him. And months later, Mario heals and is back fixing roofs in Panama City. And the question is, what's owed to him? How does he get to be part of the society he's helping rebuild and make stronger? And how do his beneficiaries see that actually their strength and survival depends on Mario getting stronger and being here? So we're thinking about a resilience framework that is along those lines, and some of the things that we think should be part of the Green New Deal for workers is firstly millions of dollars pouring into a public jobs program to make cities, societies, and homes much more resilient. A public jobs program that doesn't purely focus on construction, but equally focuses on care and the social infrastructure. Secondly, a path to skills and apprenticeship programs. Thirdly, legalization as part of what this workforce gets. Immediate legal status to stay and build and be part of the community that you're rebuilding. Equally, the overcoming of criminal convictions for those, particularly African Americans and Latino communities, that are restricted from the good jobs in these industries because of their criminal convictions. And labor rights, and all of that together would not only help Mario, but would actually help the Army vet whose home he's rebuilding. So that's the workforce part. I think, Naomi, just to build on your work that you did and what you wrote about following Katrina and that whole thinking, some of what a lot of, what was so important then after Katrina, and what you and others helped so many people see, was the embedded inequality in disasters, right? That is not, all disasters are not made equal for all who go through them. What we're seeing, and what many people are seeing now with 15 years of experience, is the same can really be said for recovery and resilience efforts. Everybody is not hurt equally in in the years following. And so, for example, recoveries and relief efforts have actually become the most powerful hidden driver of inequality in the country. Wealthy white men who own homes get richer after disasters because lots of FEMA money, Army Corps of Engineer money, and government money comes to them. They leverage it just like home ownership is so connected to race and wealth in this country. They leverage it. Meanwhile, communities of color who are renting lose money. So there is an enormous flight of racial wealth in communities after disasters. These are the kinds of things I think that the Green New Deal needs to stem and stop and reverse and repair, not purely the physical damage. And just to I would just say the little mention that Maria made of stopping a detention center because it crept into the Everglades is exactly that very exciting point of connection that the Green New Deal can make between communities and the environment around them.
I want to pick up.
Yeah,
Tom, just
because the
jump in.
Green New Deal is still, being shaped. I think we all project the amazing things that it can be a vessel for. And with the immigrant rights movement, I think, I'll speak for Flick, we've been grappling, because there's been such an impasse in legalization, we've just been grappling with how do we move through to a new conversation. Part of that conversation is looking at the root causes of migration and linking our foreign policy, economic, military, foreign policy to the displacement of people, and really making sure that there is a tangible recognition that this policy or that policy actually displace, and actually quantifying some of that. I think when we think about, we haven't been a big part of the traditional climate movement. I don't think that there's, partly, just to be honest, we've been whack-a-mole, like just responding to attack after attack. And there are bodies of work that are moving forward. But I think that, we carry traditions, like in Latin America, el buen vivir, right? Which is really an orientation towards living in harmony. I think our battle, this work can be very spiritual, because ultimately we are like so interdependent, and we need each other, and we are part of the flora and fauna of this planet, and that vision is so important. And sometimes we're so on the defense, and I think something like the Green New Deal can help us to move towards our most aspirational ways, with very concrete short-term and long-term orientations.
I mean, that's a really important point, that migrants are carrying with them ways of living and that we have a lot to learn from, and that doesn't get discussed very much by the traditional environmental movement, right? Which has a xenophobic streak. Like, let's be honest and talk about that a little bit,
Yeah.
because there's a reason why migrants haven't, felt welcome, right? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Because there's a conversation. Oh, is this for Patrice?
Either of you, yeah.
Go ahead, Patrice. I was gonna say one last thing is, because there is a parallel when we fight criminalization, we're fighting against being disposable people. Like whether you're immigrant, you can deported. If you're low income or black, you're incarcerated, and your flow is determined by the economy essentially. And I think that in many ways the climate work is around consumption and being this disposable culture.
Yeah, I was taking notes. I tend to doodle. I mean, the harsh reality is that America's racist. Wow, there was like no gasps. Everyone's fully.
I expected some applause.
Everyone's aware.
Or systems are racist, or medical system, or or criminal system, or it's just inherently racist. And so, and it's not just America, right? Like that's capitalism. That's how it's designed. It's it feeds off of that. Why does this matter? Because you think about, for instance, what is involved with climate justice, what happens, right? So I talked about disasters, talked about earthquakes, all these different things. And we also mentioned on this panel here about like the slow killers, right? So what's the number one slow killer? We're talking about respiratory diseases. We're talking about things that develop from your environment over time, and you don't realize something's wrong, right? And if you are black and you are immigrant, and let's say you're a woman, and let's just add that you're LGBT on it, right? Like let's just add all the intersections which many of us fall at. How likely are you to go to the doctor, right? How likely are you to be able to get time off from work if also we add to that you are low to middle income, trying to make ends meet and have all these different, I feel my heart racing just mentioning all of these different layers. And the reality is that they are very, very true, right? So I'll mention a quick story of what I remember is Lise in Miami, actually, and she has Haitian TPS, right? And so when, I told you that the lawsuit is what's holding that in place, right? And so they said, we're not going to give you new work permits just like that, but what happens is your old work permit is still valid. So by that I mean the old work permit from June 2018, that's when your work permit is, right? June 2nd, 2018. We're now in 2020, it's still valid. Now you try explaining that to an employer. And that's the job that she had to do, to explain to her employer. So of course her employer didn't believe her, and we talked about it, and I said, well, let's get it in writing. You can't always use the workman's tools to dismantle, but sometimes you can, right? So there's no power like the written word, apparently, according to white supremacy. And so we used that against them, and the long and short of it is she was able to continue to work because we were able to cite and say, listen, you can be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for not allowing this person to work. Now, I mentioned all that just to say more obstacles that arise because you are an immigrant, right? And we haven't mentioned the Bahamas yet. Everyone knows what happened in the Bahamas with the recent hurricane, and they were not granted TPS. And that's not for lack of movement. That's not for lack of petitioning. That's not of lack of people who care. We did all the work that you're supposed to do, and the government refused to grant it. And it's politics, it's racism, it's xenophobia, it's all of the obias, but they're right in your face. And so, one of the things that we worry about and that happens whenever we do talk about legalization or any of these other different pieces is who benefits from them, right? Who doesn't benefit from them, like what Saket was mentioning, and what does that mean? And unfortunately, Black people are usually facing the brunt of that all the time. We're normally the ones that the odds are against in the first place, and so Black Lives Matter.
Thank you so much. I think that the way in which the Trump administration has targeted TPS immediately and with laser-like focus is something that hasn't received nearly enough attention, because the significance, one of the really areas of real significance, I think, is that international law doesn't recognize climate as a legitimate basis on which to provide refugee status, right? Because when the UN drafted the convention, they know about climate change, right? And so where we're at now is we're in such a xenophobic moment, such an anti-immigrant moment, that people are afraid to reopen the convention because they're afraid of losing rights as opposed
That's
to
right.
adding them, right? So there's this lock-in, and TPS was like this loophole, right? Because it really is the only mechanism under which people can get some kind of legal status, even if it is temporary, that specifically lists natural disasters as one of the bases. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Trump administration, one of the first things they did was systematically go after people who had TPS protection, because they understand that we are in a moment where more and more people are on the move, and they wanted to shut that down. Were you going to jump in? And then we're going to open it up to questions.
Sure,
Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. Just so many things that kind of triggered thoughts on for me. Yes, the 51 convention, the 67 protocol did not anticipate climate change. It didn't anticipate a ton of scenarios, actually. And which is part of the reason it's quite difficult to sort of look on it as a successful, as its implementation is successful, certainly recently. And in fact, there are reasons to. Even if you are, really eager to act on climate, migration, cross-border in particular, to avoid the refugee convention or any treaty process, because it takes a long time. And imagining the international community actually having consensus on something meaningful is really difficult, even if it had best intentions. And I think you're right. We're not there at this particular moment when it comes to expanding immigration policy and rights. It is important to just throw in a couple of elements of this. There are regional agreements that do include environmental, sort of consider environmental disaster. The Organization for American States has an agreement that includes sort of environmental disaster as a possibility for being able to move. The African Union also has language that would be relevant for climate purposes. The Human Rights Committee did consider the asylum appeals of a Kiribati man trying to stay in New Zealand and thinking about human rights as a possible way to actually advance the needs of those that are moving, again, more so cross-border. But thinking about climate change as actually an impact, a negative impact, obviously, on the right to life. And so there are ways in which we're thinking about the international regime that might be useful. And again, the strength of any international decision-making really is about the countries that are participating and their willingness to participate wholeheartedly. But there is, I think, an important set of avenues, and it's certainly a narrative around rights that I think we can really look to as a possibility.
All right, we are going to open this up to questions. There's a mic this is the mic over here, one mic. So anybody with questions, please
Yeah, people.
Yeah.
pass it around. Yeah? All right, be a talk show host.
How you doing?
All right,
We are in New Jersey.
you can put your hand up and Avi will come to you. Don't be shy. Saw a hand over there.
Avi's going to get some exercise.
So Phil Donahue. Actually, while he's traveling, if I can just say one more thing, which is that, especially as it intersects, they're interesting in the conversation in the international law world and about migration. There's a lot of ways of sort of looking at alternative regimes, like these regional instruments, et cetera. But one big piece of this is actually opening up labor migration possibilities. A lot of the writing out of Australia and also New Zealand is on this in particular. And it's interesting. I'm concerned that there isn't a reparative element to it. So it really cherry picks those who have the language skills, who have the, sort of the luxury that are between 18 and 44. So we also have to be kind of mindful of how we talk about the intersection of migration, labor, work, and climate displacement.
Like guest worker programs, Maxine, that type of thing?
Yeah. And in particular, they don't, the most sort of vulnerable of the frontline communities are not actually included in that, unless they include some other provision for families or extended family, et cetera. But
It can be so exploitative, yeah.
Right.
and what defines a family even to begin with, right? So like we mentioned LGBT communities, we are talking about like who is a family in that situation and who gets to benefit, then age, you know.
All right.
Hello, my name is Renee. I am with the Green Party of New Jersey. Something that we feel very strongly about is decreasing our military budget in the United States. Can you speak to how your organizations work to advocate for that?
So there's this campaign called Defund Hate. Anybody ever heard of it? Yay! Woohoo! And you, I see you. Right, and the whole point of it is...
Say what is it called again?
Oh, Defund Hate. So hashtag Defund Hate. Y'all should go look at the hashtags on Twitter. We're always doing stuff. And so it's a coalition of mostly immigrant groups, but our sole purpose actually is to reduce things like the military budget, and in particular also CBP and ICE, so how much DHS gets every year and what that looks like, because yes, their solution to every sorts of crisis is over militarization and criminalization of individuals, and that's normally Black people. I feel like a broken record, but I swear it's true. Like, I'm not even being cliche. I wish I was.
Yeah, my personal experience, I in some ways got radicalized by the anti-apartheid movement and a divestment campaign. And we've been talking and in some ways moving towards trying to link the divest from fossil fuels and divestment from prisons as a way to creating more intersectionality and more building the bigger us and then the bigger we. But in terms of the military budget, absolutely, I think that's a big gap. And as we're looking at our foreign policy and the way that it harms the environment and displaces people, I think is very key. So thank you.
And at the risk of inserting presidential politics on a debate night, I will say that there is a very live debate within the different presidential campaigns around this question, because okay, people know where I stand. Most people do at this point, because I won't stop tweeting about it. But one of the most significant differences on the Green New Deal plans between the Warren plan and the Sanders plan, and is this idea that you can green them, whether to green the military or kind of start defunding the military. And so the Sanders plan does call for cutting more than $1 trillion from military infrastructure that is currently guarding fossil fuel infrastructure, like securing fossil fuel infrastructure, and moving it over to the Green New Deal. And I think that's pretty significant.
Hi, good evening. My name is Daniela. I'm a current Rutgers student studying public policy. Number one, I'm very excited to see that this panel is diverse and not predominantly white speakers, so thank you for that. And in the talk of migration, it was touched upon dealing about water in the water crisis. And we saw that there was a day zero not too long ago in Cape Town, and not a lot of people have talked about the water crisis and how capitalism and imperialism, especially in the United States, has displaced and will continue to displace migrant communities, causing a larger migration. How can we talk about the importance of water crisis in the aspect of cutting down capitalism and really attacking on the imperialism that this country has and will continue to have on our migrant communities?
Well, I guess I would just say that with any crisis like that, whether it's the water crisis or food scarcity, the question to ask right after you're told it's a crisis is who's benefiting from it and who's losing, and what institutions were involved in creating the crisis. So everyone in Cape Town is not experiencing a water crisis, and everyone in Mumbai is not experiencing homelessness. There is a person in Mumbai who lives in a 21-story building with swimming pools inside it, you know. So it is important to frame it as a crisis, but just like a so-called natural disaster, it was made of decisions. Now, I think this connects to the important conversation about the law that we were having. You know, the law is simply another word for power frozen at a certain time. There was a time when this building didn't exist. There was a time when the concrete was fluid, and then it set. And what gets hard set is culture, behavior, norms, beliefs, all get hard set in the law. And so the next question to ask about a crisis is, okay, if it's happening, how are we using it? What is the point of the crisis to us? The water crisis, or, for example, the destruction of homes after a hurricane, is an important way in to talk about who has the right to these things and why, who's left out and why. And these are the things we need to be asking. So there are people migrating by choice for whom it's joyous. And then there are people migrating out of necessity for whom it's traumatic and tragic, right? And so I would just continue to interrogate the word crisis in that way. I mean, there are people who are illuminating the water crisis in important ways. Our partners at the Institute for Policy Studies, the Poor People's Campaign, a number of people are starting to think about the water crisis. But to come back to your formulation, Naomi, about the twin fires, I mean, the people benefiting from the migrant crisis or the crisis of water are ultimately framing this as an issue of scarcity. Mm-hmm. And that is the nourishment for the forces of xenophobia and white supremacy in this country. It's the forces for casteist powers in India. And so those are the dots I think we should use these crises to connect.
I'll just chime in really quickly to say, Danielle, I think, right, you're a student, I'm a professor, I feel compelled to give you a reading assignment. And everyone actually, I think, would enjoy it. One, just to kind of to connect to the prior question about the military, to the extent that these conversations about the intersection of migration and climate are new, I will tell you there's an entire defense infrastructure that's been thinking about this for a very long time, and there are conventions that, the convention halls that are full of people with different gadgets and other disturbing drones and things for border security that become relevant. And Todd Miller wrote a really excellent book about it called Storming the Wall. If you feel you're getting too much sleep at night, read that. But then also read Jason Hickel's The Divide. He talks a lot about how we got to where we are. He does a very sort of long view and provides a really excellent through line that actually, again, to sort of have my own sort of refrain is, we have gotten here for a particular reason. The 500 years that we're talking about is quite relevant, and he has a really nice way of describing why it's important that we just first do no harm, right? All of the aid that we give is dwarfed by all of the other ways in which, say, global trade is conducted today. So that might be helpful and exciting for you to read. The other resource is related to sort of thinking about water and conflict, and here's where I'm not a glass half empty or full person. I'm sort of like the water's here. I don't have this sort of optimistic approach to life, but I do think it's important for us to think about how we frame why crises happen, but also why don't they happen, right? Talk about post-traumatic stress, but also talk about post-traumatic growth, because that actually is what happens most of the time. What are the circumstances in which conflict over water have actually improved the relationship between nation states beyond even environmental concerns? And there are examples with El Salvador and Central America where you actually see that water was a point of potential, sort of a literal, sort of the olive branch, the river that connected instead of divided. And so there are examples of that. There are examples of countries that do fall into crisis and others that do not, and a potential for deep engagement. And actually, as someone who's also a fan of biomimicry, nature tells us that as well, right? We've been told survival of the fittest. If we sort of abstract that to the to the ways in which humans interact with each other, what we know is that when there's stress, the natural world, trees talk to each other. They're like, hey, this thing's out to get us, you know. Why don't you bitter up your bark, or you know, whatever it is. There's increased cooperation and increased information exchange. These are possibilities, actually, for a really, I think what the Green New Deal is doing is saying we are actually thinking about this as an opportunity. So I think that reframe is also really critically important.
Okay. Yeah. I'm Jonas Attilus. I'm a graduate School of Public Health. Actually, I'm Haitian. I was doing the earthquake. Thank you. I moved from Haiti to Mexico with a refugee status. The unique reason I could do that is just because my dad was already a refugee there, so I could move from Haiti to Mexico. Most of the Haitian was actually stay in Haiti. You have the U.S. Army going there because whenever something happened like that in Haiti, the U.S. Army will go. They will try to not let people move, like to reach the Florida coast. It's really strategic. This is really common and with the U.S. But something that I see that you guys didn't put focus on, it's because most of the people like me were fortunate enough to move from Haiti to Mexico or now to the U.S. We are really privileged. Most of the people put the stress on the neighboring countries. Okay, countries who are already poor already, they put the stress on it. Because when people talk about like migrant issues, they think like, oh, they are going to invite us from the south to the US. I recently went to Greece for a refugee class also. And even in the European Union, people are like thinking, oh, like the Syrians are going to invade us. But actually, when you look at the data, most of the refugees, they don't have that much resilience, that's enough resources, enough privilege to make it that far. They stay in the neighboring countries who are already poor and put more stress on. Yeah. And something also I want to add, because I moved from Haiti to Mexico, I spent a lot of time in Mexico, I studied there, I graduated there too. Something that I know for sure, the US sent a lot of money in Mexico. So as soon as you cross the soft barrier between Guatemala to Mexico, they send you back. Actually, that's all my dad ended up in Mexico, because when he crossed the border, the soft border, he didn't have a Spanish accent, he has a Creole accent. Because he didn't have a Spanish accent, they couldn't send it back because he didn't know where he'd come from. So they have to talk with him, and by talking with him, he asked for asylum, so they give it to him. So something that I want you guys to know, it's like there's a lot of money like sending to Mexico just to keep people as far as I can. Like it's like literally the US is the place that you cannot come, you cannot touch. And even when I come to this country and I look at other Haitian like me, I'm fortunate, I'm here under a student visa, but they have a lot of undocumented Haitian Spanish, you see what I mean? And even like for my final project, I'm literally working on access to healthcare for undocumented people. Because I think we have to talk about those issues. Like people who are undocumented in this country benefit like the Medicare, like $10 billion every year, but those people don't have access to care. You see what I mean? So it's like we take from them, but we don't provide them no benefit, no social benefit. And migrant actually, when you look at migrant with their status, from the same status with a native, they provide more because they receive less. You see what I mean? It's like they provide more, but they receive less. Absolutely. And even to have access to care, they will not go because they have cultural barriers, language barriers. Those type of barriers make them less going into the services.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, could get some responses. Thank you. Yeah. Patrice, did you want to say? Did you want to?
That's right. And the Mexico money, like the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP. I forgot what MPP means. How could I forget what MPP means? But yeah, that is true. Yeah. That is correct. And even the idea about like healthcare not being afforded to folks, like folks with DACA have a struggle getting healthcare. You can't access ACA, Affordable Care Act. And then the one thing with what someone mentioned before, I didn't want to not mention Flint, and I didn't want to not mention the fact of like, you know, racial disparity and how that impacts who has access to clean, affordable water, and what it means if there's a racial divide, and ditto on the class issue, and you know, class is really important when we're talking about race. Thank you.
Can I, what was your name, sir, again? Jonas. I just want to say thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise here. And I would just say that this is an opportunity to agitate the room, and particularly for anyone in the room who is a non-immigrant, who is fighting for climate justice, and who's fighting for this better planet and the Green New Deal. There was a time when it was the consensus almost in the climate movement that Jonah's story had nothing to do with climate justice, right? And we have to get to the point where we understand that that story has everything to do with climate justice. In fact, that's, you know, that's the story at the center of the Green New Deal. And it's exactly why we need to, while we're in this fluid moment where we're all defining the Green New Deal, we should not end up where healthcare did in the United States, where, yes, healthcare was important, but it was, you know, not the right time to include immigrants in it. That can't be where the Green New Deal ends up. And that's why we're all in this fight. That's why we're all here together. So thank you.
Thank you, Saket. We're actually at time, so I'd like to just
Lightning round.
provide an opportunity to everybody on the panel to offer some final remarks. Yeah?
Can we do a couple of quick questions?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
lightning round?
Couple quick ones, and then we'll wrap up with
Just
them.
stack 'em.
Yeah.
This is in the conversation?
Yeah.
Guys?
Yeah, just stack 'em.
Be super quick and we'll just get a couple.
My name is Francis. I'm a student here. My question was just, for some people who I've discussed with the Green New Deal, they've said that a big issue they have is they feel like it's too ambitious to for one plan, and that they would prefer it to be multiple plans so that you could to sell, because they feel like, oh, anybody who's against it, if they knock down one part of it, everything goes away. So what would be your argument to keeping it as is in terms of everything together as one plan?
Great question. All right. Thank you.
Get a quick one?
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm an anthropology student here. When we were talking about interdependence, it kind of popped in my head that America's kind of really reluctant to admit that it's interdependent. And I wanted to know, like, if you think that admitting that would kind of challenge America's fundamentals given its history of racism, and maybe that's why, as an institution, America is so hesitant to admit that it needs its migrants. Thank you.
Yes.
Wrap those into the final thoughts?
Wonderful. I'm
Oh,
glad.
one last one.
Oh, all right.
Hi, my name's Michelle. I'm also an anthropology student. So I'm actually here with the student paper, The Daily Targum, and one of the stories we've been covering a lot this semester and last is about the Lincoln Annex School. It's a local New Brunswick school, and a lot of the students, well, all of the students are at risk of being displaced, and possibly instead being sent to a site for a new school or a replacement school that is just physically unsafe for them to be there. The community is also has a lot of immigrants, and it's primarily people of color. So I kind of just wanted to hear from you guys how we can actually apply all of the things that you've been talking about tonight to something that's happening within our own community here. The students and different groups have already been rallying a lot, but what are some additional things that we can do to kind of resist these factors?
Well, these are all great questions. I'm not sure all of our guests from out of town are going to be able to answer the local question, but certainly feel free, because it is a very, very live issue here, and extremely disappointing that our university, which talks a great game about the importance of diversity and community engagement is expanding a hospital at the expense of local students in New Brunswick who are predominantly Latino. So thank you so much for raising that. But yeah, let's wrap up and try to respond to these three great questions.
Want to start?
Well, my wrap up would just be more questions for my fellow panelists. So just to lift up some stuff that I've learned from both of you, from being on the journey, and from you, Maxine, from reading your work is, Patrice, I just think from your work, we've all learned in the movement how to be the boldest even while you're in the most difficult situation, right? And Black immigrants have come into their own and become a recognized constituency. And I was wondering if there's lessons from that experience for who we think of as the constituency of the Green New Deal. And then on your question on the local school, I think both of you have showed how in different ways, thinking about the role of a local or regional fight helps us imagine a much bigger solution. And that seems to relate to your question a little bit.
Okay, so I'll give a real quick, and I guess it probably will answer all three. So to your answer on the interdependence, America is invested in protecting America, and they've always been, right? I think someone mentioned earlier about how Haitians are allowed to come here, wet foot, dry foot policy. If you don't know it, read about it. That's just America's history, and I think it's of the people of today to change that. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a fight. With regards to the two other questions about it being too ambitious, the Green New Deal, and then the local issue here, I'll mention this. We've won nothing without a fight, right? You have to demand, you have to fight, unfortunately, and you have to realize that there's going to be pushback. You also have to realize that depending on who you have in the fight, so I'll mention in DC, for instance, really quick, we had an action with Black API folks. It was for DACA, it was for TPS, DED, big, bold, because of course that's how we do apparently. Thank you, Saket, for mentioning. The API folks had been going there for every week for their own actions, and not a problem. It was a part on the Capitol that has a little podium. They did their protest, all this. The day they merged with Black people, well, there was about 150 of us, mixed Black and API, and within 5 minutes, we saw increased police presence. Within 10 minutes, they had dogs, and they had dogs weaving in and out of the crowd. And then as soon as the last congressperson left, they told us we had to take down the mic and we had to leave. So my point of this story is you have to fight, and you already know the tactics. I don't need to tell you what they are. But I think when you're in that fight, one, ask for the boldest thing possible, no matter if they tell you it's impossible. Don't negotiate with yourself. Two, prepare for the fight. Well, Democrats could learn that. And the second thing is prepare for pushback. And you want to have as many people possible there with you and of different backgrounds, and you want to show who's really going to be impacted by what's going on, but prepare for pushback even from the university. Always remember whose interest it is that they're protecting. I'm never going to be invited to Rutgers again, but thank you.
Of course you will. Yeah.
Do you want me to go? I don't know if I can answer those questions, but I agree with Patrice in her recommendations. I was thinking about what you're talking about being in a hurricane. And I don't know what it's like with earthquakes or other natural disasters, but in a hurricane, there's a moment where we're all in it together. People are not at work, and you're buying the boards, you're buying the water, you're checking in on people, and there's this thing of we are one and we're together, and that kind of perspective of in some way the great equalizer. People have to leave their homes in some ways. But then there's like the moment where the scarcity mentality fits in, and then like your limbic brain and survival. And I think there's something there around learning and figuring out in a deeper cultural way how we really shift towards recognizing our interdependence and building a broad, ambitious frame, whether it's one bill or a million bills, but still connecting the dots. Because natural disasters are visible, the systems that oppress us sometimes are invisible. And so there are the opportunities to make the change. And I'm inspired by the Puerto Rican people who have gone through colonization, a brutal fiscal, saqueo, ripping apart, hurricanes and earthquakes, but are finding new ways to be sovereign and new ways to live in harmony and to push forward.
Yeah, I also, those are all really big and excellent questions. And I will just sort of use the Green New Deal as too big as a way to sort of frame my wrap up, which is to say that, to sort of state the obvious, which is climate change is the biggest, right? And in fact, to have an appropriate response, you need something that is ambitious, because anything less than that is actually insufficient and will still lead to great likelihoods of catastrophe. But beyond that, it's scary to people because it's sensible and comprehensive, right? One of the biggest biggest arguments of detractors is that, well, you're putting people out of work and you don't care that the coal miners won't have anything to do after the fact. Well, in fact, no, this is an acknowledgement that a new economy, decarbonized economy, actually has losers. Read part 2, right? Go to the next page. And that's what we haven't done. It's actually because of the failure of the way in which we atomize and isolate and compartmentalize these issues, and we're so used to that in our policy that when we get something like the Green New Deal that is really sort of a closed loop in some meaningful ways, that it seems too big. But again, it's necessary for the issue. The compartmentalization of the environment is also a big element of this. We see it throughout our governing. The EPA has an administrator, but it has nothing to do with commerce for the most part, or the Treasury, where a lot of the decisions that are about environmental degradation happen. You see it all through the law school curriculum. I'm an environmental law professor, and I do international environmental law, but do we really want just environmental law professors to solve this problem, right? No, and in fact, we can't meaningfully engage in some of the big questions, right? If we're talking about the impact of trade, for example, on everything, but certainly, the ocean quality, the issues of supply chain, labor, these things aren't sufficiently integrated, and we have suffered from, I think, being too isolated and compartmentalizing it in our way of diagnosing the problems that we're seeing. So EJ has always defined environment as where you live, work, and play. And what we're seeing right now is finally a moment in which where we live, work, and play is in conversation for not saving the environment out there, but saving ourselves.
Thank you so much. I just want to have a Rutgers student body appreciation moment. One of the things that drew me most to Rutgers was just what a beautifully diverse student population this is, and they bring such rich experiences, in part because there are so many immigrant students here, and it was just really beautiful to see that in action tonight. And maybe we need more spaces which draw on that deep knowledge within the student population. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to our I want to underline just a few of the real, some of the take-homes for me tonight were, when we talk about justice, the first thing to do is stop the crime, right? And that is something that Maxine repeated a few times. We need to lower emissions really fast, because there are things that we can manage and there are things we cannot manage, right? And we are definitely entering into a rocky future, even if we do all the right things. But we have to stop doing the wrong things really, really fast to be able to manage this. And we have to take care of each other, right? And we also have to take care of the people who are doing the caretaking, and not treat those people as if they are able to handle things that are not possible to handle. I'm really struck by Maria's last message about that impulse that we see in the midst of disasters and in the immediate aftermath. We find our best selves in crisis, right? And we know that when we are tested personally, by illness, by tragedy, but we also know that when we are tested by collective crises. We don't live in a system that encourages and supports that impulse. We live in a system that that actually suppresses it and pits us against each other, and that scarcity logic descends. So one way of thinking about a Green New Deal is what kind of infrastructure, social and physical, are we going to build that is going to allow us to be our best selves as we enter into this rocky future that has already begun, right? So I want to thank this amazing, brilliant panel of people. Thank you so much for coming here. I want to have a special moment for my friend Saket Soni, who I have learned so much from. And one thing I will say is that I actually quote Saket more than any living person in the world. And I quote him saying something he said to me when New Orleans was still reeling from Katrina. It was just a few weeks after the hurricane hit. We were gathered at a university and talking about, well, it was a couple of months actually, because there was a delegation from India that was there that had suffered the Asian tsunami. And it was an information sharing gathering about disaster capitalism. And this was before the shock doctrine even came out. And Saket very impatiently at one point started pounding the table and said, yeah, we get it. They have disaster capitalism. We need disaster collectivism. And I feel like my whole life, ever since Saket said that, has been about trying to figure out what that means. And for the first time, that is now not just a national conversation, but an international conversation that is going under the banner of this thing called a Green New Deal. And it is whatever we make it, right? It's not ambitious enough. That's the truth. It's not too ambitious. It's not ambitious enough because we are up against very, very powerful forces that are trying to defend an extremely profitable status quo that happens to be setting the world on fire. So the way we are going to beat that, confront that, resist that, transcend that, is by building the broadest possible coalition of people who feel deeply invested in the transformation, invested enough to fight for it, not because it's better than an apocalyptic future, but because it's better than an intolerable present. And that's what it means to be willing to broaden the conversation and not be afraid of ambition. And that's what this is about. We have so much work to do. Thank you so much for being part of this crucial conversation. It's just a beginning. Thank you.